Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our second virtual ICEAA Afterwork event. While we're disappointed that circumstances prevent us from fully benefiting from the intent of ICEAA Afterwork, which is both knowledge sharing and relationship building within our community, the Washington Capital Area Chapter is happy to be able to extend this event beyond the local chapter through a virtual platform and be able to provide the valuable opportunity to hear from distinguished senior members of our community to a larger ICEAA audience. Our speaker today, Rich Hartley, is happy to take questions throughout his presentation. As we did at the last ICEAA Afterwork, the audience is on mute. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise your hand button or send me, Remy Arnold, a message, and I'll let Rich know that someone has a question when he reaches a transition point. So without further delay, I'm excited to introduce Mr. Rich Hartley, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Financial Management and Comptroller. Rich has been a part of our community, serving in various roles of increasing responsibility and importance since 1985. In his current position, Rich now oversees $160 billion in annual resources, as well as the professional development of 12,000 members of the Air Force financial community. Rich, thanks for being here with us today. I'll now turn the mic over to you.
Well, thank you, Remy. I really appreciate your support throughout this thing. I want to say a couple thanks here before I get started. First, I want to thank Rick Collins. He's the one that put me up to this initially, so I want to thank him as well as thank ICEAA's Washington Capital Area Chapter for this invitation to speak. Also, thank you, Megan Jones, for helping us with respect to getting this thing up and running today. I've been in the workforce for about 35 years, and I spent my first 28 years in cost analysis. And I've spent the last 7 years outside of cost analysis, as an outsider looking in, but have even grown, my appreciation's even grown, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But to see cost analysis from the outside it's been real nice thing for me to see in terms of how much it brings to the table, both when I worked inside it and worked outside of it. So I've gotten a lot out of this profession. I've gotten much out of this profession, and so it's really nice for me to talk today to try to give back a little bit. So I hope to do that today. I know that I likely won't say everything today that will resonate with all of you, but my goal is to just get a few of you to take 1 or 2 tips out of what I have to say today. And if I do that, I'll consider this evening to be a success. So let me show you what I want to accomplish here on this next slide. What I'd like to do today is leave you with a greater appreciation for a career cost analysis than you may already have. And I know some of you already have a great appreciation for that. I want to hope to even grow it a little bit more tonight. Number 2, I'd like to instill an understanding, or for many of you who already have an understanding, grow your current understanding of how important it is to innovate in this profession, innovate in this field, to continually think about, how to make cost estimating better. About, 10 years into the profession, I came to the belief or the position that a best practice estimating organization ought to dedicate about 1/3 of their resources, that's people, time, money, into its infrastructure. And what I mean by infrastructure are the data, the tools, the techniques that allow cost estimators, cost estimating organizations to do their work. A continuous effort along those lines is very important for any estimating organization. It's important for the career field. So I hope to convince you to continue to help us innovate in this career field. And lastly, hopefully leave you with a tip or 2 that may help you progress in your career. This is just, in my opinion, an awesome profession. And I know you've heard speakers before me say the same thing, but for those of us who have been in it a long time, and sometimes it doesn't take that long, we really appreciate the career field. I gotta say, for me, it wasn't really love at first sight. I didn't take to the profession right away, but it didn't take long. And the more I learned about this profession of cost analysis, the more I really started appreciating how much it has to offer. To the analyst themselves, to the practitioner, it has a lot to offer, but also I really started to appreciate how much it has to offer to the organization or the institution that it provides support to, or the organization or institution that it serves. And then, as I said before, as an outsider looking in, my appreciation only grew further for this career field. So I really consider myself fortunate in that I've been able to spend so much of my career involved in doing something that I really have a passion for, and frankly, all of my career being associated with something like cost analysis that I have such a passion for. So what I'd like to do first is start off and take you through a little bit about my cost career. I want to talk to you about the kind of things I think worked, maybe what didn't work so well, with a strong caveat that there is no single path to success. Everybody takes a different path. There's one thing I've learned for certainty is there's no one recipe that gets you to success in an organization or along a career field. But hopefully, some of these things that help me be successful, maybe that they will help you in your career. So I started off my career at Nav Air. I was right out of college, went into Nav Air, and I was actually one of the first 3 Nav Air, and that's Naval Air Systems Command for those of you who don't know. One of the first 3 Nav Air cost analysis interns in a program that I understand is still going strong today, and that's hopefully for well, I'm sure for good reason. It's a very strong program. It was an absolutely great start to a career. Great organization, great learning experience. This is the first job I had out of college that I built my what I call my functional foundation. I worked in 3 different divisions in that organization. I did a number of different rotations, and I worked a lot of special assignments. And so what I you know, my kind of tips along those lines are, and I know many of you are probably beyond that stage of your career, but when I share these thoughts, it's not just for you, it's for you maybe as a manager in terms of how you manage your people, how you influence your people. But I got to say, my thought is that to be successful in this career, or any career for that matter, take that first job and build that, what I call functional foundation. Get really good at something, get to be known for something. This is where I also started to develop what I called my critical professional skills, things like team building, customer support, and what I call stage 1 of my oral and written communication skills. And what I mean by stage 1 is in the early stage of your career, when you're building that functional foundation, you really just have to master this ability to communicate within or close to your functional area of responsibility. So you have to be able to communicate cost estimating to people familiar with cost estimators. That's stage 1, and I'll talk about stage 2 a little bit later. And you know, frankly, building those skills is a lifelong task, but so you never kind of stop doing that, but you know, really got to focus that on your first job. I was also fortunate to be able to move up to a team lead role pretty early in that organization, and that's where I really learned how to manage and got a chance to mentor new recruits. So being a fairly recent college grad myself, having the ability to mentor brand new college grads was a great experience. So my takeaway from that job, my first job out of school, was take the early stages of your career to learn your craft. Learn as much as you possibly can. And when I say that, I mean broad and deep. I mentioned the fact that I had a couple of rotations there for a reason. It's one thing to learn your craft in a specific area, a specific niche of that craft, but you want to try to broaden that as much as you can. Again, without sacrificing, though, to get the depth you need to build in the early stages of your career. Like I said, this is your chance to get really good at something, to build this reputation, to build these foundational skills that I found in when you build the cost estimating foundation, that you can then leverage that throughout your entire career. Also, I would encourage your people at that stage of your career, because you're probably never going to have more time than you have when you're starting off your career, is use that time to step up and volunteer for special assignments. It's amazing how much you'll learn, and you'll find that in many cases, those things that you signed up for, those duties outside of your normal work responsibility, where you're learning another component, another aspect of your functional, building another aspect of your functional foundation, they come back to your benefit later. I had signed up for some special assignments. In one case, it was just to go on a trip. I wanted to go travel somewhere. And 5-10 years later, I find that that's part of my portfolio as a manager. So the background I gained on that special assignment really came in handy years later, and I had never known that that would happen. So use that time you have in the early stages of your career to get a little bit of that breadth and to step into special assignments where you can. Next job I had, AFCAA, AFCA we call it. That's the Air Force Cost Analysis Agency. And the reason I left NavAir was my first boss had moved, and he asked me to come over and join him. And it was a good move. I actually kind of left NavAir too because I really wanted to test myself. I felt like, hey, maybe I just got lucky because I was successful at NavAir. Maybe I just got lucky in the job and the environment, and I gotta see how I can do in a different environment. So I wanted to test myself, and I wanted to learn a little bit about another organization. Got to be a team chief in that job, working with a new service, Air Force as opposed to the Navy, and a brand new commodity, working space systems at that time. Also got to do really a different cost estimating job with a different product. That organization is primarily responsible for independent cost estimates. And so whereas in my NavAir job, I was working in direct support to a program office and really getting to know and understand primarily the budget process, here in this role, I was more involved in the Department of Defense's acquisition process. So you learn how to get a program approved through the bureaucracy here in the Pentagon. I also learned a lot about different techniques. Whereas at NavAir, in direct support of a program office, worked a lot of bottom-up, build-up estimates, a lot of direct analogy estimates. Here, in the independent estimating role, often use a lot more of the parametric techniques. Also got to experience the ability or got to grow in terms of my ability to learn how to learn how to understand programs much more quickly. So in that environment, I worked multiple programs over a period of time, as opposed to being focused on the same program maybe for a couple of years at NavAir. Obviously, you don't get the depth into the program that you might have worked on it for a long period of time, but I did learn how to absorb the higher level information on a program quicker. And so that's a skill set that I think benefited me later on, the ability to kind of learn about multiple programs quickly. The other thing that I got out of that environment, that independent cost estimating environment, is this ability to build my conflict resolution skills. And I often tell people that are entering the cost analysis profession that the old adage that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is really applicable in cost analysis. The cost analyst takes a lot of heat in many cases. Many times you're the bearer of bad news. Many times you're telling the program manager things that they don't want to hear. Your program's going to cost more than you think it was going to cost. It's going to cost more than you have money for, and it's going to cost maybe more than you think it should cost in order to be successful and get the program approved. So you're going to have a lot of critics in that situation. Well, what I found was that when you live in that environment, as a cost estimator often does, you build this resilience, you build this ability to resolve conflict that is worth its weight in gold as you move up the chain of command in your organization. And then you're at that point, when you're in that leadership position, you're no longer responsible for just interfacing and dealing with with your own functional area. You have a lot of demands placed on you to work through conflict across the enterprise, and having that skill set built as a cost estimator is really invaluable. The key takeaway for me in that job that I wanted to share with you is this was kind of like stage 2 of my career, and it was really my effort to build a little bit more breadth into the functional depth that I built, my functional area of expertise. And really that was very helpful for me in terms of building qualifications and skills that I used later in subsequent leadership positions. Just that broader knowledge really came in handy. After the AFCA job, actually I was still in the AFCA job, and I got sent off to school up in an Army program. So it was a long-term full-time training program where they sent me off to get a master's degree with a bunch of folks from the Army. And that was great from the standpoint of exposure and experience to yet another service, and building relationships with people from another service. So getting even a broader perspective on the entire Department of Defense portfolio. I also considered it really a gift and had a lot of gratitude for it. And I felt it inspired me to work even harder. The fact that my institution had sent me off to school for full time for 13 months to get a master's degree. So I take away from that experience is For those of you in the Department of Defense, try to get joint experience where you can. Leadership and the hiring process puts a lot of weight on having that joint experience. Now I know a lot of you I'm talking to probably don't have that opportunity. You're in the private sector, or you're you're maybe even some of you are outside of the continental United States. But the analogy there would be, if you're working in support of government programs, try to get a little exposure to the commercial side. If you're working in for a certain business unit or agency, try to get some exposure or experience outside of that agency and support another agency, or support a different business unit within your corporation where you can. That broader experience, even when applied in your own functional area, really can help build your skill set. Left that job left that assignment, and they sent me back to headquarters. So I worked in what's that was the cost analysis director for the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Costs and Economics. That's what we call SAF FMCC. There, my responsibility was I ran what we called the AFCEAA, the Air Force Cost Analysis Group. That organization was responsible for taking the Air Force's program office estimate, the Air Force's independent estimate built by AFCA, and reconciling that to come up with an Air Force service cost position. The experience, the benefit of that job was I really got to look at the entire Air Force portfolio of platforms. I got to look at the entire life cycle cost. That job required what I would call intense negotiation, reconciliation, and a lot more conflict resolution skills. It also gave me an opportunity to start to understand and contribute to the process side of cost estimating, how the Air Force kind of runs the bureaucracy of estimating. What are the things that are involved in the guidelines, what are involved in the regulations. We got to help build those regulations, mature those regulations, improve those regulations, and also got a taste of a lot of the responsibilities of a headquarters staff. Take away from that job for you, if you're ever offered, take a Pentagon tour. I found that experience invaluable from the standpoint of understanding how leadership thinks, what kind of information that they use to make their decisions. And so they just sitting in a meeting watching a 3-star general or a political appointee who's on the leadership team, the kind of information that works to help influence their decisions, the kind of information they need to influence their decisions. I didn't even realize it at the time how much I was gaining that I would later use when I had to brief leadership and convince them to accept my recommendation. Being a part of those meetings, and sometimes just as a fly on the wall, was invaluable. It improved my communication skills. I got a lot of insight into this decision-making process, as well as kind of the broader spectrum of bureaucracy. So invaluable experience there. So if you ever get that opportunity, take it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the Pentagon, right? Most of you support agencies. So if you ever get a chance to participate or get involved in a project where you get to support the higher headquarters staff, if you get a chance to work and support a project that supports your company's C-suite, do that. Any chance you get to support that, to support or get involved in that leadership decision-making process, will help you better tune your product to help inform that leadership decision, to influence those leaders. Next job I had was I went out to work at the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office Cost Group. And this was probably the best job I've ever had. And I've got to say, I've had, in my opinion, a lot of great jobs, but this was a chance to run an entire organization with a lot of autonomy given to me from my bosses. Autonomy, but also tremendous support when I needed it. So if your bosses will give you the support when you need it and let you run, I can't imagine a better scenario than that. Had a lot of enterprise level responsibilities in this job. Got to support both the corporate decision process, so a lot of our products went right to the director of the NRO, and this is where I found that the skills I had acquired in the Pentagon, the education I had gotten in the Pentagon, really came in handy in terms of briefing at that corporate level. but we also provided a lot of execution level support to programs. So we supported the broad institution, broad spectrum of responsibilities that the institution had. And so that in itself made it great, made that a great job. This is where I really focused and I think improved my kind of phase 2, I would say, of my written and oral communication skills in learning how to take the cost estimator's functional expertise and recommendations and then communicate those to leadership or other cross-functional lines to people who really don't understand and don't have the experience in the field of cost analysis. That's a skill set that you need to build over the course of time as you move up in your organization and you're responsible for not convincing a cost estimating team and the direct customers of cost estimating team, but is supporting the broader leadership team across an enterprise. And that's a skill set that, frankly, a lot of cost estimators, myself included, have a hard time because we're so passionate about what we do, and we tend to love the details. And that's where you really need to just kind of practice that skill set and be involved in briefing outside of your functional area to hone that skill set. Got a chance again to continue to work negotiation, conflict resolution skills. I worked a lot of interagency skills. I am also in that position, having the responsibility of a 50 or so person organization. I think we grew to about 60 or 70 over the course of 4 or 5 years. Got to grow as a leader, and that wasn't always smooth. Fortunately, I think growth requires a lot of slips and falls here and there, and that's certainly what I did in terms of managing this mid-level organization. Managing any kind of, I would say, mid and large organization, they're tough. It's tough to do, especially the people side. What I think was and is tremendously important when you're trying to grow as a leader is retrospect, and probably even more importantly, introspect. You got to look at how you're performing over time. You got to look back on your performance. You got to be willing to look inside and hear what people are telling you and react to that. And that takes a little while. It took me a little while to learn that, because you tend to, if you're successful, you tend to think you've got it figured out right. So my recommendation is, in any kind of leadership role, look back on how you're performing. Make sure your people they feel like they can tell you when you're going astray, when you're going down the wrong path, and then you have to act on that. Because if you don't, they're not going to continue to tell you. So you got to be willing, they have to be willing to tell the emperor when they have no clothes on it. And again, this was a growing and learning experience for me that required a lot of retrospect, required a lot of introspect, but you can't succeed without it. And in some cases, you may not get it that day. You may not get it that week. You may not even get it that year. There were certain things that people had told me that 2 or 3 years later, I figured out. So, but it will help if you look back on how you're performing and make sure that you're listening to what folks are telling you. You're not going to agree with everything, and everything's not going to be right. And sometimes you are going to be right, but you got to look back and you got to analyze it. At the NRO is also where I came up with that 1/3 rule. We really stepped up the game with respect to data collection, methods development, and model development. Found that dedicating resources to that effort in my organization really helped that organization mature and continue to grow into a best practice organization. It continues to do so today because of that focus on data collection, methods development, what I call the cost estimating infrastructure. That's also the time when I got much more heavily involved in organizations like ICEAA and in cooperatively working with industry. Wasn't something that frankly, I wanted to do. Our leadership asked us to do it, and we were frankly skeptical about it. What they wanted us to do was try to get at understanding why our estimates were so much different. Our independent estimates were so much different than the contractor estimates, and leadership has a hard time with that, and frankly, it's hard to deal with. And they wanted to get to a position where we were using the same models, tools, and techniques as industry, and so therefore then we would get to a position where the only differences would be in the assumptions going in. Now, we never got that far, nor do I think that that is really an achievable goal, but we certainly got further down that path where there was where we formed what we call a cost IPT. And this IPT's objective was to get at improving cost estimating capability on both sides of the fence, getting at common problems that would help us advance our methodologies and maybe beat down some of the differences in our estimates, or at least if we couldn't minimize those differences, better understand them. And so the way this forum worked was we had a general session where we would talk with all contractors in the room and talk about common problems. And then we also got into individual one-on-one sessions where we could actually talk and discuss proprietary data. And if we had a specific issue with a contractor with respect to their estimating technique, or there was a disconnect between government and industry, we could work through those and better understand those. That process was tremendous in terms of helping us advance the state of cost analysis in that organization. And by the way, that process remains today. It's still in place in a lot of organizations. My takeaway from that job, and this I really think helped me as a leader later on, was as soon as I learned that not everybody thinks like you, not everybody approaches things or problems like you do, and that doesn't make them wrong. So when you think you're pretty good at what you do, you tend to think people should think like you. When you're running an organization, you tend to think people will think like you. Not everyone in a 50, 100, 200 person organization is going to think like you, and they don't need to. As soon as you understand that and are able to leverage that diversity of thought, you're better off and your organization is better off. And it takes a lot of us who, again, like you said, we think we're pretty good at what we do. It takes us a while to realize that. So that's my key takeaway. As you move into those leadership ranks, start to understand and appreciate the diversity of thought that the people across your organization bring. Next job I had, I came over to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Cost and Economics in the Air Force, and that's SAF FMC. I spent 9 years in that job. That's probably the job that I think I had the most significant impact on my organization, any organization that I've run. Took on a major initiative in that organization. We had suffered, the Air Force had suffered about a 60% decline in its cost estimating resources. And I was chartered with the task to rebuild the cost estimating capability. Now, that decline in cost estimating wasn't really anybody's fault. There was a decision made that was back in the days in the mid to late 90s, where the reinventing government, the acquisition reform, the call it better, faster, cheaper initiatives were put in place, where the belief was that we could get success on programs, avoid cost overruns by assigning total systems integration responsibility to the contractor and using firm fixed price contracts or fixed price incentive contracts, or even cost plus contracts with strong incentives on them. So when you're in that environment and you believe that environment will work, you really don't need your government cost estimators. And so that so happened in conjunction with downsizing government initiatives. And so the resources that were surrendered were cost estimating resources in the Air Force. And when a lot of those programs went awry, when a lot of those programs overran, some of them overran by 3x. We had $3 billion programs that grew to $10 billion. Leadership said, we got to rebuild this capability. And so I took on that responsibility. I was very fortunate to be in a situation where leadership, I had leadership support that I needed to rebuild a capability. And we took on a comprehensive approach where we didn't just look at putting the people back in the system. We looked at the processes, we looked at the tools, we went through a major initiative to improve those, and even improving our customer base. And we looked at our customers and expanded them. Instead of just working on programs when they're already in the acquisition process, we found that a lot of programs were going awry because they were anchored improperly. Their initial baseline was far too optimistic. So we put in process a scheme, a policy to get in and look at programs in the planning stages. And this is beyond the 5-year budget. And if we looked at those programs and got the cost estimating team to put some realism into those planning estimates and put some realism into that 5-year budget, especially the out years, those programs would be easier to baseline as we learned more and more about them. So we didn't have these unrealistic assumptions going in that we had to fight tooth and nail when we got into the acquisition process. So that whole initiative was very comprehensive in a sense of looking at people, looking at process, looking at customer base, and also looking real hard at the tools and techniques that we were using in our organization. Also got to experience a lot of what we call corporate support here, and that's supporting the corporate process in the Air Force, where you have to really take your functional hat off and not look at it from a parochial functional view, but look at it in terms of helping the decision process across the enterprise. You start to learn a lot about what the other functional areas needs are, what their priorities are, and you have to then work to balance those against your own needs and priorities, and really try to get to an optimized position. So that was really a kind of a learning experience to take that functional hat off and start to work across functional lines. My takeaway from that job, it was a big organization, and not related to anything I just said, is when you're running a big organization like that with a major initiative underway, you've got to manage your work-life balance. And you have to manage your work-life balance both for your own success and your team's success. And this is more and more important as you move up the chain of command, because you will set an example for the organization. Now, how do you do that? You do that by applying the fundamental principle of leadership. You got to delegate responsibility. You got to be willing, and this is hard for us estimators to do because we like to dig into the details. You got to delegate your people, and you do that through guidance, direction, and trust and confidence in your staff. Now, how do you get there? How do you get to a point where you can give them guidance, direction, and trust? Well, you develop them. You got to develop the competencies. So this idea of managing your work-life balance is really tied to this fundamental principle of delegating responsibility, which requires developing your team. So as a leader, don't ever lose sight of that. And since I spent a lot of time in that job, I'll give you a second takeaway, and that is if you plan to move up in your organization, into a leadership position, start to build that cross-functional, that cross-organization skill set. This is really how a lot of the work gets done as a leader. It gets done outside of your organization. So your organization and the managers, if you've delegated properly, they'll start really producing and doing most of your organization's work. You're the one that's got to run interference for them. And so that's where building those cross-functional relationships and experience is most important. Left that job that's when I left cost analysis. Went into a job as the Air Force's Associate Deputy. I should have flipped my slide here.
Okay, Rich, we actually have one question from the audience, if you've got a moment for that.
Sure.
Ryan, I think there you go.
Hello, sir. How are you doing? This is Ryan Horn from Technomics. I was just wondering, how active do you feel like you had to be when you were developing all these opportunities for yourself? And do you have any advice on how to do that specifically within the DoD as opposed to a company or anywhere else?
Yeah, so when you say how active, I think that for me, I think hard work was the kind of the key to my ability to continue to get opportunities and then capitalize on those opportunities. Caring about what you do and working hard. So I didn't really, I was never one that went out and looked for opportunities. And one of the things I tell people is don't spend a lot of time worrying about your next promotion. It'll come if you do the right things, and the right things are working hard, seeing opportunities and capitalizing on those, and it'll come. Now that doesn't mean you close your eyes. And part of my, I guess, problem is, even when I was in the early stages of my career, is I felt like I had to be involved. If somebody was doing something and I wasn't involved in it, I felt like I was missing out. So that nature keeps you pretty active and keeps you pretty engaged. So that in itself allows you to get involved in a lot of things that you might not otherwise have gotten involved in. That's why I stress this early stages of your career to go off and take special assignments where you can. Support a project that's looking for people to support it. So I guess the answer to your question is, I think I was pretty active, but active from the standpoint of taking on work, doing work, trying to learn, as opposed to figure out where my career was going. To be honest with you, I never thought I was going to make SES. And I didn't think I was going to make SES 10 years into my career. And so that wasn't something that I said, look, gosh, I got to figure out how to make SES. But I did feel like I had to figure out how to do the best job I possibly could and learn the most about it. So I think I'll touch a little bit more on that, but I hope that at least begins to answer your question. Okay, let me just kind of try to wrap up my career here pretty quickly. Next job, so got out of cost analysis and became the Associate Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Plans and Programs and Requirements at some point. That's supporting the process of really building the Air Force's long-term, near and long-term budget, something we call the Program Objectives Memorandum. That's the 5-year budget. That's the thing that we fight, scratch, claw amongst each other here in the Pentagon, fighting for our resources, debating issues across the services. And then beyond that, there's the Beyond 5-year program that I also was responsible for putting. That's called the Air Force Plan. Got a lot of opportunity to work with OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the other services. Got even more, I got to step up to the next level in supporting the Air Force corporate decision process. And what I felt like I was able to do there in that organization, because of my cost analysis background, was ingrain a lot of analytics into their decision-making process. And specifically, I was able to bring a lot of the cost estimating into, not as much as I would have liked, but bring some of the cost estimating into their decision-making process. But more importantly, it was the analytics. It was the ability to lead the organization and really act as a kind of a forcing function to make sure that these decisions that we're making that are going to affect the Air Force for years to come, that they have some analytical support behind them, that they're not done based on anecdotal evidence, based on hearsay, based on just gut feel, and that happens. And if you don't force this analysis into the system, you have a lot of misses, and those things, when you make those decisions that are bad decisions in the planning and programming process, you pay for them for years, and you pay for them with a lot of debate on the Hill. You pay for them with a lot of debate with OSD. So felt like that my time spent there was well spent in having that appreciation for cost analysis and applying it and the broader analytical skills to a planning and programming process. My takeaway, and it touches a little bit on the question that I just got, my takeaway isn't related to any of that. My takeaway is, don't let apprehension, fear, doubt, or even some level of comfort you have in your current position slow you down. Don't let that prevent you from taking that next step in your career. What I found is most people have to grow into a job. Rarely do we ever step into a job as a full-up round. So don't be afraid to take on a job that you think might be a little bit more than you can handle right now. Of course, don't step into something you're sure you're going to fail in, but don't let this apprehension or the fact that, boy, I'm really comfortable in my job. Every job I left with some reluctance and some apprehension. I liked most of my jobs. I liked all of my jobs. And I mean, I had to convince myself to leave the NRO. But, looking back at it, as tough of a decision as it was, I'm glad I did it. It helped me grow. It helped my career grow. It helped me broaden. So push yourself, take a chance. Anytime you're really battling with that decision. I've done it multiple times, and I've never looked back on it with regret. Next job I had was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Installations, Environment, and Energy. And, that's something you might wonder, well, what's a cost estimator doing in that world? Well, all of those programs that you're running, the installations program where you're running the whole portfolio of Air Force installations and facility sustainment, restoration, modernization, optimizing investment. You're running the environmental cleanup program. You're running the energy program. All those programs really benefit from business case analysis and analytics when they're included in the decision-making process. And that organization, that's why I was brought into that organization. And frankly, I was a little skeptical about whether or not I had the skill set to run that organization. And it worked out really well to having that business case analysis background, that analytical foundation, to help me be successful in that job. So, my takeaway from that one is, analytical problem solving and conflict resolution skills that you build as a cost estimator are priceless. And I've said that multiple times. I keep repeating that theme. So let me share with you some of my thoughts on the profession of cost analysis. It's a profession that has come so far since I started doing it in 1985, in terms of the approach that we use, the skill sets of the analyst, the tools and techniques, and even the customer base has evolved and grown over time. And so some of this evolution of cost estimating is no doubt a function of our computational powers, our computer capabilities. We're able to do things like more sophisticated risk analysis. We're able to build data lakes and databases, and then execute and exercise those databases, which just makes them better. So certainly, the advances in computers and information technology has helped. But I believe that this evolution of cost analysis has really been driven by what I call the persistent innovation of the analysts that are dedicated to advancing this trade. That, in my opinion, has been the real catalyst for the success of cost analysis as a profession, for the advancements of cost analysis as a profession. I mean, I tell you, this wasn't the case everywhere, but when I came in, a lot of cost analysis was, you would take like labor hour estimates from an engineering team that weren't necessarily working from databases that you were working from, and apply rates and factors, RAP rates, to those engineering estimates, and then take a total cost estimate and hand it over to a budget team who then spread it over multiple years, and without really a lot of insight into how that estimate really should be phased, but really driven more by budget constraints. And clearly, that isn't how all estimating was done, but there were a lot of cases where it was done for that, with that lack of sophistication. And it's come miles since back when I entered the profession, and that's why I'm so proud of any of the advancements that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of. It's mostly my team's work, but this is what makes this such a great profession, is that people have a passion for it, and when they have a passion for it, they make it better. And so let me just kind of talk through what I consider to be my achievements I should say, that I've been involved in, because much of the stuff that I've accomplished has been done through my team. Number one, track record and lessons learned. Essentially what this is comparing how well you did over time, and this is something that came about when I was working out at the NRO, and we take the typical challenges. Your estimates are too high, they're too conservative, you always overestimate. I said, well, no, we don't, and we want to prove that to you, that our track record is better than yours, or at least the information you're getting. And so we put this together, and there was a lot of skepticism. The thought was, well, you can't really hold us accountable for our estimates because programs change over time. And so why should we be holding ourselves accountable? I said, that's exactly what we need to do, is we need to hold ourselves accountable and understand. That'll give us an understanding of where we're missing, where we're missing, which will then cue us onto why we're missing. But the idea that the estimate changes, and so it's really not on the cost estimator, is, in my opinion, a fallacy. It's really a fallacy for the independent cost estimator. Because when the director of your institution, your organization, asks you for an independent estimate, they're not saying, I just want to know what you think this thing's going to cost if all the technical parameters are right, and if nothing changes on the program. We include engineering change orders in our estimates. So by design, our estimates are meant to cover normal change in a program. So my view was that we ought to be held accountable to how well the estimate performs against the program. Now, of course, there are major exceptions, like in the space world, adding a payload, adding a satellite. You certainly would have to normalize for that. But the decision was made that we would measure our performance in terms of estimates versus actuals, and then also have another measure. We would look at adjusted estimates for major changes on a program against actuals. We did this for our organization, and then we also did it for the contractors' estimates. And we did a comparison there where we could show how we were performing. Now, contractor estimates are different, right? Because they, by design, don't include a lot of that change in the program. So they're supposed to be a little different. But having a better understanding of what that difference is and why is extremely valuable to the decision maker when you're trying to explain why your estimate's different than theirs and which estimate applies under what circumstances. So I lumped this with lessons learned because essentially what we did after we built this track record is we were able to better defend our positions. We were able to better advocate for our estimates, but we were able to better understand our estimates. It clued us in on so many areas where when we actually look back at where we missed, why we missed, and we actually started doing something called retro ICEs, retrospective independent cost estimates, where we would take the estimates and run them just like they were run originally. And this is often 5 years later in a program. We would run that original estimate against the program with the new baseline assumptions. So you'd get a chance to see what impacts of program change influenced the cost estimate, how much of that cost estimate difference was attributable to those changes, and then look at the other things where you may have evolved your methods and see how much of it was method driven. So we really got an understanding of how much we were missing the mark and why. That led to, let me just jump down to the third bullet, this independent technical assessment. One of the things we found was that we were, that a lot of the estimating error, the difference between the actuals and the estimate, was driven by our technical input parameters. Things like weight, things like lines of code, things like complexity, things like commonality, and that those were being, in many cases, optimistically assumed early on. They were growing over time. Sure, we had weight growth algorithms and things like that, but they weren't sufficient. And so what this led us to do was, again, under the premise that when the director's asking you for an independent estimate, they're asking you for what you think a program's going to cost, not assuming nothing changes, but assuming normal changes. And they're not asking, hey, what's this program going to cost if all these weights are right? They want to know what we think the program's going to cost. And it's on the estimator then to make sure that there's some realism, especially the independent estimator. I realize that the program estimating teams are a little more bound by the program definition. But on an independent estimator, they're responsible for making sure that the input parameters they use to drive their models are indeed realistic, and therefore the estimate will be realistic. So what we built was, and this has evolved so far since I left the field. So it's again a credit to the innovators in cost estimating. It's a credit to the technical minds that are applying their skill sets to this capability. But build a set of tools that would help estimate the independent parameters. So what is the weight? Well, often when a program is in its early conceptual stages, there's a lot of optimism about how small these things can be, or how much they can weigh, or how much. Like a great example in the space world is you have something called a bus. It has all the housekeeping functions. It carries the payload, which is really what performs the mission. Well, that bus has to be big enough. It has to have enough power. It has to have enough structural stability to do what it needs to do for that payload. Oftentimes, that estimate for how big that bus needs to be is optimistic. It may be based on a commercial bus, and the modifications that need to be made are understated in the early stages of a program. This independent technical assessment capability, parametric in many cases, either parametric or analogy based, really did help us get at more realistic parameters, and which improved the reliability of the cost estimates. But it also did something that's probably even more important. It helped us as cost estimators understand and better engage with the technical community. And so we could challenge the technical assumptions and frankly build better, more realistic program baselines as a result. Backing back up a bullet, you see this bullet says linking cost and schedule, independent technical assessment. I'm sorry, independent schedule assessment. Like I said before, in a lot of cases, the estimators were handing over total cost estimate. Matter of fact, we were doing this for some programs in the NRO when we started this independent schedule assessment technique. Basically would hand over to the budget team this lump sum cost estimate and have them spread it. So first we started looking at algorithms to spread that cost estimate in a more consistent manner or more historical based manner. But then we got in and really started to, as we found through our lessons learned and our track record, that we had often had optimistic schedule assumptions that were driving error in the cost estimates, that we needed to build an independent schedule assessment tool, so a capability to put realistic schedules into our cost estimates. So we collected the data and basically built a lot of parametric techniques to estimate the schedule. So essentially what you see we're doing right here is we're linking all these components of a cost estimate that shouldn't be discrete. You shouldn't have a set of data that you're using to build a cost estimate and then apply another set of data, disparate data maybe, to figure out how to develop that schedule. The same schedule databases ought to be, the same database ought to be used for schedule assumptions and cost estimating assumptions, and even to some degree the technical assumptions to make sure there's consistency there. So building that kind of capability across those functions really was something that came out of this track record where we identified the deficiencies and then built the tools to increase the capability. And a lot of these tools they've advanced so far since I left the field. So again, like I said, it's credit to the innovators out there. See what we got here. I'm trying to speed up here a little bit. Another thing we brought into this is something we've instituted here in the Air Force that I think has made a significant impact. This is something we call the non-advocate cost assessment. Essentially what we found was that a lot of programs were getting input into the long-range plans, and they were doing it based on maybe foot in the door bias, enthusiastic program managers or enthusiastic people out at the labs, and they were frankly optimistic estimates getting into our long-range plans. And this really tends to serve as an anchor for programs. It's really hard to come off those numbers once you've got them in the baseline. So we felt like more properly baselining programs in our 5-year and beyond budgets would go a long way. And so we instituted a process called the non-advocate cost assessment, where people who weren't program advocates would look at these estimates before they went into the POM, into the long-range plan, and just to put a little more realism. And that has come so far since we initially envisioned it. We initially thought that, well, we would just provide this information and the programmers and the planners could use it if they wanted. It's got to be right now a critical part of the Air Force planning process where those estimates are used and even a lot of value is put on them by organizations like the OSD, who oversees the Air Force budget. So a tremendously significant impact that makes cost estimators' lives easier later when programs enter the acquisition process if you baseline them right in the planning process. Risk analysis part one. One of the problems that I found earlier on was we were running these very complex Monte Carlo simulations, but in the end, after hundreds of parameters were input, we were getting unrealistic results. For example, we would have development programs that historical experience has shown sometimes they grow by a factor of 2x, even 3x in some cases. We would run a Monte Carlo simulation and see that the result would be plus or minus 3 or 4% one standard deviation. And here's a family of programs that are doubling, sometimes tripling, software lines of code growth, doubling, tripling, yet we were getting standard deviations out of these very sophisticated Monte Carlo simulations of plus or minus 3%. It just didn't make sense. And so one of the things that we really found by looking at that was an increased attention to detail and an awareness of the shortfalls, the pitfalls and limitations of risk analysis, and also really identified some alternatives, some different ways of looking at it. And what we learned was, boy, that these input parameters like correlations, and even more importantly, the input distributions in something like a Monte Carlo simulation are tremendously important. And if you don't get those right, if they aren't based on some hopefully historical data, which is really tough to do in terms of coming up with these distributions. But if you don't get those right, you might as well not run the Monte Carlo simulations, because it's going to give you flawed answers. Spent a lot of time on that. Did a lot of work in inflation analysis. We had seen that as we look back on our programs, our track record, a lot of flaws in our estimates were driven by faulty inflation assumptions. We were under the impression, and many people still are under the impression, that you have to use OSD inflation indices to build your cost estimates. I argue you don't. You certainly need to use those to toggle back and forth, but when you're building an estimate, it ought to be reflective of what you're likely to experience. We were seeing forward pricing rate agreements from contractors. We were seeing history where inflation was significantly different than OSD inflation rates, yet we were using those OSD inflation rates to project future costs. That didn't make sense. And so what we did was we looked at historical behavior and found some published indices that best reflected or represented that behavior, and used that to project in the future. Again, then when toggling back and forth between real dollars and constant year dollars, we were bound by the OSD inflation indices. But building that estimate initially for that you will then toggle from, we found that we could use the right inflation indices, and so that was a very worthwhile endeavor. I already talked about the cost IPT. Again, getting the estimators together to with common interests, tremendously valuable. Sitting across the table with estimators from industry, estimators from support contractors, estimators from the government, and collaboratively working to solve problems. That process is still in place today, and again, I think a real achievement for the cost estimating community. Let me kind of blow through some what I call slips here. Look, I already talked about this. Getting your work-life balance it's tough to get right. You got to work on this as a manager. Another kind of slip on my part as a leader, pushing too hard on the numbers. Buying into this idea that things will be different this time. Now, clearly, you have to consider how things will be different on the new program versus the old programs versus the database, but you need some evidence-based or some logic-based, as opposed to trying to do that with no reasonable justification. And as a manager responsible, you're often the one that has to run interference and gets a lot of pressure from leadership to push those numbers. You have to be very careful as a leader not to push too hard on those numbers. Certainly making sure your team is adjusting for how things might be different is important, but you can't push too hard on them. Right sizing initiatives, the number and scope of initiatives. If you're running a cost organization, or for that matter, any organization, I've been guilty of trying to bite off more than I can chew. And so you have the organization running too many initiatives, and as a result, you either do a bad job on them or you don't get the closure on them. I found that when I actually skinny down the number of initiatives and really could put the best resources on those and focus on getting them to closure, that really made us a lot more successful. Balancing work versus managing and micromanaging. That's tough as a leader, and it's real tough as a cost estimator. So again, as you move up into the management role, be careful about that. You're going to want to do the work. You will more than likely like the work. You got to find that balance where you're assigning responsibilities, and that you're managing as opposed to doing the work and micromanaging. So that's something that I had to learn along the way. Getting comfortable with the 80 or 90% solution. Most of us are estimators. We like to be perfectionists. That can be to your detriment as a leader in an organization, or even as a manager in an organization. You got to find that point where you've done enough work to put forth a credible product, and not spend too many extra resources getting to that perfect product. And that's, again, like I said, tough to do as an estimator, because I can't understate the value and the importance of credibility as an estimator. So you got to get it right, but you got to find that point where you're not spending too much time perfecting that product. As a manager, another thing you got to learn is balancing how much time you spend in your front office with how much time you spend walking around, kind of walking around with a team. And that's hard to get right. And frankly, I don't know if I ever got it right. Hopefully I'll get it right someday. But as a manager, as a leader in an organization, you wind up with a lot of throughput. You got a lot of taskers that come in, you got a lot of requirements for meetings that can draw you from your team, and that can get you to a position where you get distanced from your team. You got to be careful of that. I'm not saying I ever got that right, but I know that it's an issue, and it's something that leaders need to be mindful of. And I mentioned risk analysis part 2. I had resolved, my organization to fix the risk analysis process. We never did that. I kind of swore off Monte Carlo simulation and said we got to find another approach, and we never found an approach that was the end-all solution. So felt like I didn't accomplish what I'd like to accomplish on risk analysis. I've frankly been away for a little while. I don't know how it's evolved. I look forward to as I retire soon, getting back and looking at how risk analysis has evolved. Let me wrap up here with 2 things, 2 more slides, I believe. Hey, some tips. Look, have a passion for what you do, care about it, but as an estimator, be careful, don't take it personal. It's easy to lose sleep. As I said, people are gunning for you, people aren't gonna like your answer. It's never personal with them, and you can take it personal. I shouldn't say it's never personal, but 99 times out of 100, it's not personal. Those folks are advocating their position, and you're coming up with your position. You can't let it eat you up. But that doesn't mean you don't have to care, and you can't care about what you do and be passionate about it. I already talked about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Everybody wants to challenge you. This will prepare you well for any job you might take in the future. Talked a little bit about this. As an estimator, it's often more about the briefing and the comms than it is about the content. That doesn't mean the content might not come back and haunt you if you don't get it right, but you got to get this briefing, this communication piece right. You got to figure out how to take your estimate and take it to a level where someone who isn't an estimator can understand what you're doing. So you got to be able to roll it up and brief it effectively. Along those lines, I encourage you to understand the technical aspects of your program. Look, as I said, multiple times here, there are going to be people that are going to challenge you. And what you don't want is you don't want a gotcha. If you don't want to have them ask you a question about some technical aspect of the program and have you look foolish because you don't know it. It may not necessarily even relate to your cost estimate, but you need to have a general awareness. Now, you don't have to be miles deep on the technical aspects of a program, but you need to generally understand it, and it'll help your credibility. We'll be able to work for anybody. I've always felt like what's helped me in my career is I can work for anybody, and you need to be able to do that. Be able to work for and with anybody. Get good people. You'll find, especially as you move up the chain of command, the emphasis you place on getting the right people will make you much more successful and will save you a lot of sleepless nights. Build relationships. Important from the very start of your career. That's how you'll get things done. And care. Do the best job you can in any position. I think, to answer that question earlier, I think that's what's helped me, is caring about what I did no matter what I was doing. That's it. Look, before I take questions, I want to just close with 3 things. I want to encourage you to get involved in professional organizations like ICEAA. I already talked about the benefits to the cost estimating community of collaborative efforts, and 2 heads are better than 1, 20 heads are better than 1. When you put minds together to solve problems, it goes a long way. Number 2, I want to encourage you to never lose sight of the fact that the analytical skill set that you've built as a cost analyst is foundational and will serve you well no matter what you do. It'll even serve you well as you make decisions at home. Might drive your spouse crazy, but it'll serve you well in any decisions you make. But it'll certainly help you in any career path you choose. And lastly, and this is my shameless plug for innovation, is I want to encourage you to build on the credibility and utility of cost analysis. Work constantly to address criticisms, gaps, shortfalls in this profession. I think you'll find it probably some of the most rewarding work that you'll do in this career, but you'll also really help the career field. You'll help the product. Notice I said, address the criticisms, gaps, and shortfalls. These are the things that help us build credibility, is when we're able to address things that the outsiders, that the stakeholders, that the customers think are shortfalls in the process. And so it'll make your life a lot easier. So that's my spiel here. I hope I kind of gave you, you never know what the audience is looking for in a session like this. So I hope I gave you a little bit of, like I said, maybe 1 or 2 tips that you might be able to use to either advance your career or advance the state of the cost analysis career field. So thank you all for participating in this event. Thank you for all the work you do. Many of you are saving the government or saving your company millions by getting these things right, by making the right decisions up front. We have a lot of examples here that we've built in the Air Force. We're able to show how the cost estimators have, and I'm not exaggerating here, have saved billions of dollars by the work that they do. So thank you all for what you do. Thank you all for participating today. I'm happy to take any questions for as long as they come in.
Hey, Rich. Yeah, we do have a couple of folks with questions. So first, I'm going to go to Mr. Bill Barfield. I've unmuted you. There you go.
Thanks. Hey, Rich. Good to see you again, virtual though it may be. Leroy Baseman, Jay Jordan, be proud of your career briefing today. That's a blast from the back of the rack, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Brings a smile to your face. Rich, you use cost estimator and cost analyst in the same context for convenience, but do you really see a big difference in their career paths?
Bill, I thought you were going to ask me why I didn't walk around the office more.
I could.
Yes, you could. So I don't really see a difference. I use them synonymously. I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I don't know what the difference between an estimator and an analyst is. I mean, you could probably, bucket them into, call them different things. Like, but I don't even know where. I don't know the difference. So is there a difference?
I kind of look at it basically. An estimator is looking forward to develop a cost. An analyst is looking at costs that already have been developed and what's it mean to look forward. So one's got crystal ball completely in their world, and the other has got what's already happened and crystal ball in the world. That's the analyst. How's that feel?
Yeah, well, I would challenge that because I believe that they both need to. So one of the things that you get a lot as an estimator is you get the criticism. Oh my goodness, your estimate can't be right because it's based on the way things were done in the past. It's old data. Programs aren't built like that anymore. And so, that maybe kind of goes to what you define as the estimator. My argument back is estimating is forecasting. And forecasting is taking knowledge of the past and using it to project the future. If you're not forecasting, if you're not taking knowledge of the past to figure out what you're going to do in the future, and it can be the recent past, but if you're not doing that, you're guessing. And so, that's the crystal ball side of things, but we're not in the business of guessing. And so our job as estimators and analysts for that matter, is to look at that past knowledge and use it to forecast the future, the most challenging piece being adjusting it properly for how things might behave differently in the future. And that's, and that's essentially, what it comes down to. So for me, whether you're forecasting the future, in this estimator crystal ball definition that you laid out, or you're this analyst that's looking at the past, using past program or current program, you got to do the same thing. You got to look at past behavior. Again, it can be more recent, but you got to look at the past to project the future. Happy to take a counter opinion on that.
No, it's well said. Both of those two careers do have to look for a future technology in order to incorporate a current cost estimate. futures like where's economics going to be, labor rates, or rare materials for production. So they both have to look to the future as well as the past in order to do an estimate or to analyze that's what's already been done.
So Bill, you left me with a homework assignment. So I am actually going to go back and do a little research on estimator and analyst, and next time we're together, we will have a little conversation on, because I do want to make sure I got my facts right on that. Actually, probably not facts, but I'm a little better informed on that. So thank you.
Thanks.
All right, next I'm going to go to Ben Truskin, who has a question.
Hi, Rich. I currently work at the CAG, and so I've been a beneficiary of a lot of the good infrastructure that you've talked about and laid in place. And I wanted to ask a question related to something really pertinent to us now, which is the non-advocate cost assessment. How did you get that process started, and did it require, initial top cover from leadership, or was it some of the work you talked about with retro ICEs and laying in initial program office estimates and showing how, they were totally inadequate in a lot of cases that, really got things off the ground?
Yeah, so the latter was my attempt. We never really got there. We started, and actually we had Rand do a lot of great work for us to help better understand the Air Force's track record. But that helped, but we never kind of got to a solid enough position in time for that policy to be put in place. What really helped, and you hit it, is the top cover. I mean, looking back on the success that I saw at the NRO and that I saw in the Air Force, I got to attribute it a lot to having leadership support. Leadership top cover is so important for an estimating organization. And so when we were trying to put the NACAs in place, we got a lot of resistance. It was so significant that we went into the Secretary of the Air Force's office, and I was pitching this plan, and the person who didn't want this plan to be part of the process, one of my detractors, it was a small meeting, actually did not like the Secretary's decision, slammed his books down, and kind of walked out of the office. But if I didn't have the support of the person who's in the job I'm in right now, the principal deputy, I wouldn't have been successful. I would say the most important thing is because they're the ones that ultimately signed that document. We put it in policy, but without leadership support, you're not going to get that policy through. It's got to be coordinated across functional lines. It's got to ultimately be signed by the Secretary. But we knew we had to have that policy in place because I didn't want the process to be hostage to the power of personality. So I didn't want it to be something that you just had to continue to work and convince people of. I felt like we really needed to get into the Air Force policy so that it would outlive me, it would outlive my successor, it would outlive maybe the person that was in that job that didn't have the influence or the background. So a lot of it was leadership support. Now, how did we get there? We got there through a lot of what you talked about there, and that is having some better insight into why programs went bad. Rand helped us out a lot with this. And so we were able to show, what kind of cross growth we were experiencing on a program by program basis, why those programs were improperly baselined up front. And so having kind of the evidence to show why things were going wrong and where they were going wrong was really important. But so it's a combination of things. Like we kept saying, and I'd love to come talk to you at length about it because this was about a 3 or 4 year endeavor to try to get this whole comprehensive plan in place. Like I said before, though, I was very fortunate. I was fortunate that I stepped into that job, and about 2 months into that job, they had a leadership meeting with the 4-star generals and the senior political appointees in the Air Force, chaired by the Secretary and Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and a tasker came out of it that said we need to assess and consider rebuilding cost analysis and business case analysis capability because there was a major program that had hit the press and made the Air Force look bad, and the Air Force leadership was struggling. So a lot of things kind of very fortunate to walk into that situation. So leadership support and evidence, I think, and frankly, a lot of well thought out, balanced approaches to the solution. So you got to have a reasonably acceptable solution that you would then be able to propose to your leadership to get their support. So a reasonable approach up front, well informed, leadership support, and evidence.
Thanks for the elaborate answer, Rich.
You're welcome.
All right, next we have a question from Peter Braxton. Peter, you should be unmuted now.
Hey, Peter.
Hey, Rich. I don't know if you've seen the Back to Basics memo, but we're currently working under the framework of the Business Financial Management Cost Estimating career field to update the competency models for CE and FM. And I know you did a lot of work back in the day to kind of get those two separated out and with adequate training and apt training for either group. You talked a lot about all your work on the budget side. So in a nutshell, I didn't know if you could share one or two key learnings or things that cost estimators really need to understand about the budget process to help inform that work that we're doing right now.
Yeah, great question, and I'm very familiar with what you're doing. So they need to know a lot about the budget process from an awareness standpoint, because it's probably it's one of your primary customers, one of your primary stakeholders. And if you don't understand the budget process and you don't understand all of the complexities associated with the budget process, all of the kind of the external influences on the budget process, then you can't provide your program manager and the budget team an estimate that is well suited to fit into that budget process. And what I mean by that is you have to understand things like, how money can get spent, what the contract structure is, so that you understand where to put your risk dollars. You have to understand how that budget process is, what kind of scrutiny it's going to face from the standpoint of obligation and execution metrics. So you're not stuffing a lot of money into a program that the program manager and frankly the service is going to run the risk of losing because they're not executing on time, or that the process of building the POM, which CAPE and OSD-KEG is involved in, that passes muster with them. So your service or your customer can lose money if you improperly place money in a budget year that can't be supportable or justifiable. So knowing that budget process is important. Now, how much depth do you need? Do you need to completely understand Anti-Deficiency Act violations? Do you need to understand program element codes and things like that? You need an awareness of it, but you don't need to be a budgeteer. You just need to understand how your estimate's going to get used. What execution metrics they're going to follow, what oversight, how Congress is going to look at the program, how Congress is currently looking at the program. There's probably no better person to talk to understand the potential impacts of congressional action on your program than the budget person. The budget person who is supporting and frankly in many cases engaging with the appropriators, who knows what's coming. So that interface, that dialogue is really important so that you can properly phase your estimate and frankly, provide that stakeholder, the budgeteer, a product that they can use. Hopefully that helps. I mean, that's something we've spent a lot of time talking that through.
Yeah, no, appreciate it, Rich. Thanks very much.
All right, and I think maybe our last of the day, I'm going to go ahead and unmute Rick Collins.
Hey, Rich. Thanks so much for the chat today. A lot of goodness here. So I think I'm confident you achieved the objective that everyone in the audience had at least a couple things that they walked away with, be it something related to technical, something related to career, something related to leadership. So, as president of ICEAA and technical director of Technomics, I want to thank you for this. I don't really I might have a question, but I actually wanted to there's so much goodness here, but there are a couple things that I wanted to maybe just reinforce quickly. And if you want to react to it, by all means. And, I like to use the phrase, which I haven't coined, that, estimating isn't about being right. It's about minimizing how wrong you are, right? And I thought, the point you made on the slide where you're talking about kind of the things that you implemented at NRO, the track record, independent technical assessment, independent schedule assessment, that, this broader point of whether you're leading an organization, you're a mid-level manager, or you're, staff level, you need to be introspective. You need to be your own worst critic when it comes to your work, because again, this is about minimizing how wrong you are. There are no right answers, and there is always room for improvement. So I just wanted to reinforce that point, particularly for the younger people in the audience, but for everyone. Just because your stakeholder or your client loved what you gave them last time doesn't mean it couldn't have been better, and that you shouldn't be investing that extra time, right, to make it better. Right. Okay. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other thing that I wanted to reinforce was your comment about if you can get a gig in the Pentagon, and more specifically your point about being a fly on the wall and the value of that. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to go into a meeting if you're not going to be a speaker, right? If you don't have a specific role, and maybe tune out. But in my 40-year career, I have learned so much by just being on receive, even to the extreme, and I think I've mentioned this before, at least to people with Technomics, where I spent a lot of my first maybe 7 years in the field, and that was a long time ago, where I was literally sitting next to a senior analyst who was my mentor and listening to him on the phone, not on a speakerphone, only listening to one half of the conversation, but the amount I learned by just listening to that one half of the conversation was invaluable. So, a real extreme example there. So, anyway, I appreciate the one question I had, maybe real quickly, is, in fact, I gave a talk today to the ICEAA membership, an annual talk that happens, and in the talk I stressed the point about cost analysis organizations and cost analysts, trying to move up the value chain. How do you deliver greater value to the enterprise, right? As cost analysts bring a lot to the table, as you've mentioned, and maybe you make a quick comment on that. That is, in other words, I think we have to beware of underestimating our value.
Right, and that's so. First of all, Rick, you hit two of my key points. So at least I know one person got a couple points out of this. So I'm happy. Yeah, that the idea that that you all in this field can do so much to make it better and innovate. That's the main thing I wanted to stress, how important that is. But part of this innovation is not just about figuring out how to do better cost analysis. It's also innovating in terms of broadening your customer base, broadening your stakeholder population, and the more cost analysis you do, the better it gets, and the better the organization is able to accept it. Again, like if you get those estimates in there early, you're not fighting about it later on. So really, the simple answer to your question, Rick, is it's a sales job. You have got to find out where it's best. You got to combine two things. Where's the need and where's the potential, right? The feasibility. And so there may be cases where there's a need, but you're just never going to crack that nut. Don't take that one on. Don't try to get forced cost estimating into an area that you're going to have to jam it in there with a shoehorn. Find an area that has a need that may be more amenable to the support, and that may very well require a sales job. We just had a meeting before this meeting where we got with our planners to propose getting cost estimators more involved in the planning process. And it's a sales job. I went through and explained why it's so important, you know, what kind of, and I was able to take them through a decision that in the past didn't have the benefit of realistic cost estimating up front, and we suffered some serious consequences all the way to Congress, and basically we're getting screamed at for changing direction on a program because, you know, arguably that we didn't have the right estimate up front. So it's a sales pitch, and sales pitches, in at least Rich Hartley's opinion, are best done with facts. So if you can provide some evidence about why there's a need and how you can help, then you'll be successful. And now just one quick note on that is you got to scan. You got to scan the environment, right? You got to look for those opportunities. And then once you've found them, then you weigh this feasibility and opportunity thing.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Rich. Thanks again for doing this.
Rich, that looks like all of the questions from our audience. So again, on behalf of the Washington Capital Area Chapter, thank you very much for your time this afternoon and sharing your experiences and thoughts with us.
Hey, thank you for having me, and thanks for the work that you did setting this up. So I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Everyone have a great evening.
You too. Everybody have a great evening. Thanks for participating.